All right, ladies and gentlemen, back again with another video. Before I do get started, I just want to let you know that you could probably figure out about most of these things by following my Twitter. I'm just going to link it below in the description. I pretty much tweet out most of this stuff well before I make these videos. So I kind of wait until there's enough to actually do a video on. And so I'll address that kind of first, I guess. So there's a lot of opinions on Twitter. I have a couple of specific accounts linked in the description that I would recommend that you follow if you're interested in actual physicists who might be chiming in on the discussion on that platform. Also, you may also notice if you're on there that Twitter is awash with replication attempts right now. I'll link a couple of them in the description as well. Fun to watch, but as we'll discuss, there's a variety of factors specific to LK-99 and the preps that we're seeing here that mean that likely these are going to be very, very, very low yield, but still very interesting to see. So let's get to the first item. The first item, it kind of started yesterday and has been kind of carrying through. It looks like the authors of the original studies have started doing interviews. We can talk about Hyun-Tak Kim first because he's done a couple things now. Yesterday, he has provided a video to the New York Times, and the New York Times did do an article. If you go to my community posts, I did post the article there, and the video I'm going to put in the description as well. So it's a kind of a larger piece of the material, and it seems to float. It's right next to a thermometer, right? So you can see that it's room temperature. It's like 25.8 Celsius or something like that. That's fine. New York Times had an interesting take on it. It's cool that it's getting some traction. But the more interesting thing was the interview that was given to a Korean news outlet. Let me just play that for you right now.
오늘의 신문물 LK-99입니다.
원래는 제 스타일은 논문을 저널에 내고 이제 리뷰 과정을 다 끝나고 나는 그 직전에 이렇게 올리는데 좀 거기에는 조금 무슨 사연이 있어요. 그래서 이렇게 급하게 내지 않으면 안 되는 사연이 좀 생겨가지고 논문을 저널에 내면서 동시에 그렇게 됐어요. 불가피한 상황이 생겨가지고 그렇게 했어요. 그 저자 동의가 하나는 안 받은 거고요. 하나는 저자 동의를 받은 거예요. 저자가 많이 있는 거는 모든 저자가 동의를 해서 정상 절차대로 간 거고 나머지는 그런 절차를 못 밟았기 때문에 부정이 되는 거예요. 그게 이제 샘플을 이제 지금 우리 이쪽에 그 연구팀하고 한국 물리학자들이 연구하는데 도움을 주기를 하는데 동의했고요. 그 다음에 걱정을 한다 이 문제. 아닌 상태 사이에는 불연속 점프가 있다. 그러니까 초전도이냐 아니냐는 금속에서 저항이 떨어지는 쪽으로 점프가 있는 것은 초전도예요. 그래서 금속에서 저항이 증가하는 쪽으로 있는 점프는 금속 제렌치제는 인슐레이터 메탈 트랜지션 그쪽이고요. 제렌치로 트랜지션이 생깁니다. 금속으로 가는 경우는 초전도입니다.
Okay, so as you can see, he made a pretty big deal about the drop in the resistance at the critical temperature, and he says that the remaining resistance is essentially noise, and that he didn't feel like he needed to cite the noise because it was in a previous Korean journal or whatever, but he says that whatever's remaining in his measurements he feels is just noise, and that there is some controversy about what exactly zero needs to mean for a superconductor. We will get into that discussion near the end of this video ourselves. but this is basically part of his argument there. But then he also talks about how he thinks the physics of this are pretty particular. He really is talking about this like it is a Soviet-style one-dimensional superconductor that we talked about in the previous video. So it seems that is what, in his mind, the underlying theory here. And that he says that really there's just slivers of superconducting material in the samples that he has so far, and that really the trick seems to be in the manufacturing process, right? There's insulator phases right next to the superconducting phases, and that this is actually what's giving you problems with the measurements. And so this is interesting. We'll go into more of the detail of this theory, but this is his explanation behind the wonkier results that we're getting with the other replication attempts that we're seeing. And then he also goes on to say that there was an incident. He doesn't detail what this incident is. We can surmise a little bit based on the next source as well. We'll get to that. But he said some kind of incident was going on, and that that they did go ahead and decide to publish, perhaps a bit rushed, but they did decide to publish, and that everybody involved consented to publish the paper with the larger number of authors. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is Daniel Kalish, or Kalish, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, sorry, Kalish's account. Apparently he had some interviews where he fleshes out some of this stuff and perhaps gives us a little bit more of a clue to what this incident might have been. So Kalish fleshes out this idea that Q Center, which is where Sukbae Lee, the other author, is the head of, they reached out to Kim around 2021. And since then, they've been working together to kind of make sure this is a superconductor, it seems. And it seems that supposedly Kwon, the author that released the 3-paper, didn't consent to publish. That's odd, right? Like, so apparently the 5-author paper is the right paper that's endorsed by the other 2 authors, but Kwon, who released his name with the other 2 authors' paper on there, but not the other authors, like the 2 or 3 authors that are on the 5 or 6 author paper. But this kind of counteracts the narrative that it was all rushed and that Kwon forced them to publish. Apparently they were planning to publish anyway, which is a little bit contra to the narrative that we were building before that. So maybe there's some elements that need to be verified here. Specifically in this interview, I thought it was funny that he specifically calls Kwon's contributions, quote, very, very small. You can see how Netflix is going to spin all of this, right? You can just see the movie or show, probably both at some point, playing out. This is all just a drama, a K-drama in real life. So here's where we move on to Sukbae Lee's interview. Okay, so he urges replication. That seems to be a strong undertone. He really wants other people to try. He also says that his sample is in the peer review process. The people who are reviewing it have samples, and they're going to do their tests, and that's why he can't give samples. Okay, that's interesting. But then also that Sukbae Lee is the head of that Q Center, as I mentioned earlier. The Q Center is going to arrange an event in the near future to explain things, and of course I'll cover that whenever that happens. So that is something to look forward to. He also says that the current goal is to improve LK-99. They're doing experiments to try and improve they weren't specific on what they were trying to improve. Are they trying to improve the yield, improve the purity, improve processes for thermal vapor deposition? Are they trying to do the gold variant that we've been talking about, or the silver variant that seems to be fairly elusive, but we're not sure if it does the same thing? What is he talking about? We're not sure. But the other thing that he said is that the peer review process will take about 2 to 4 weeks. And he also said that in the same interview that he thinks that it will take about a month for the world to catch up. What exactly is he saying there is kind of what I wonder, right? Because a month is about how long it's going to take, he estimates, for his peer-reviewed paper to come out. Isn't he basically implying that the rest of the world is unlikely to really reach what the level to which they're synthesizing this stuff internally until they release their own paper? And I think what potentially maybe backs that up, and my just wild speculation about what this incident is that he's referring to, They also said that they had a recent breakthrough in the manufacturing process. Apparently, so when they started working with Kentech in like 2017, they didn't have good yield or reproducibility, and recently things have changed. Maybe that is the incident that they're talking about. Maybe the incident isn't so much that something bad happened or Quan did something or whatever. Maybe they actually had a breakthrough and maybe Quan got greedy. I don't know. I don't want to imply motivations. That is a step further than we have any sort of information to do. But maybe it was something good as opposed to something bad. Maybe they developed something and he got excited, or I don't know. Let's focus on that for just a second. Kentech. So apparently the Korean Institute of Energy Technology has had a sample for like a month, and they've been analyzing it quietly to themselves, and they announced that they think that they need at least another 6 months of analysis before they're fully willing to publish. Now, see, that's a bit more like the academic rigor and thoroughness that you would normally expect with a paper, and maybe even a little bit longer than that. The tests themselves don't necessarily take, that long. The replication attempts are just a couple days. But making multiple samples, testing something over and over to make sure something works, and getting a lot of parameters. Yeah, Twitter has been doing these replications over a couple of days, like a week so far, It should take more like months. So just keep that in mind. So it looks like Kentech is actually going to do a very serious, thorough analysis, and we should follow up on that in some months. But it looks like Kentech has actually known about this since 2017. They've been in correspondence with them since then. What I want to really draw attention to is what I kind of alluded to earlier, is that initially there was very low purity and low reproducibility. So they weren't really all that interested initially. But as things have developed, they've gotten more conviction in what they believe and the claims that they're making right now, because I guess their manufacturing process has really improved recently. All right, let's talk about the part that everybody is excited about. Andrew McCalip. I'm just going to show you the video. Let's watch.
Here we go.
Okay, so the rock floats. All right, the rock floats. It's exactly what we were hoping for. I didn't think it was going to happen, but we got it. Very small yield, very small yield. They had big bricks. They were hoping for uniform bricks. There was very heterogeneous result, and only specks of it. Apparently, a few milligrams of the final sample ended up being, actually diamagnetic. Everything else was just a dud. But it was something. And I know that this is going to get more coverage because John Kukin apparently stopped by and will likely be doing a video on the race for, the room temperature superconductor and following this story. Well, guess what? I beat you to it, John. But his video is going to get 1 million views, so who even cares? And in a follow-up interview, which I'm going to link in the description, Andrew did end up pointing out something that I have kind of been thinking for the last 24 hours, but everybody's been kind of starting to say it as well. Probably LK-99 itself could be really revolutionary in what it demonstrates as possible, but probably won't directly be used in a lot of commercial applications. There's a lot of things that make it seem not very ideal for being used, but the family of one-dimensional superconductors that it spawns could be really revolutionary. Let's take a moment and try and synthesize a lot of the points of what we do know, and importantly, what we don't know, okay? So some things have been coming out of the replication attempts, like Iris Alexandria, the structural biologist who did that first synthesis very early on with the alternative cook preparation, who got actually very easily the stronger diamagnetism that the authors were talking about, apparently. Not fully verified yet, but supposedly she used some precursors that are sometimes they have sulfate contaminants, and people are wondering if maybe she got a bit of a higher yield and easier access to some specs that actually float because of maybe the sulfate contaminants. And there's this, it goes along with the speculation that maybe the structure of the superconductor the actual superconducting phase, it might not be exactly what we think it is. Due to its low critical field and the fact that it supports relatively low current densities, not to mention it seems to be very brittle and its manufacturing process seems to have very low yield right now, there's a lot of reasons to think that LK-99 itself won't be commercially applied broadly. Let's talk about one-dimensional superconductors for a moment, because there's a couple of interesting implications to that. One being that the prediction, and I'm going off of the other scientists that have commented here, the prediction is apparently not the typical Meissner effect. Apparently the super diamagnetism that you expect with a typical superconductor is a little bit different in a one-dimensional superconductor. You expect more of a magnetic torquing effect, which could potentially explain why pieces of the samples that we've seen levitating in videos, parts of them touch the magnet. Why is that? Well, there's two potential explanations. One is the impurities that we've been talking about, where Hyun-Tak Kim says, there's actually an insulator layer between the probes, and that's why this curve looks different. But then also, one-dimensional superconductors themselves they, instead of just being purely levitated, could get torqued under that field. So that's one thing that's being speculated. Once again, we really have to flesh that out before we put much credence on it. And then I also noticed, and I'll link this in the description, Professor Michael S. Fuhrer had an analysis before Hyun-Tak Kim's interview came out, completely independent. He looked at this graph and he said, that graph looks like what you'd have if you had both the superconductor and an insulator between the probes, right? So the superconducting phase could be right next to an insulator phase, and that's why instead of seeing this sharp decline in resistance at the critical temperature that you would expect, you see this more gradual decline, and potentially to a resistance that isn't actually the final resistance of the LK-99. And he came out with this comment before Hyun-Tak Kim came out and said, yeah, this is likely what we think is the explanation. There's actually manufacturing problems where the impurities are causing these characteristics to not be like a normal superconductor. And you also got to think that the size of the sample in the New York Times video suggests a pretty strong amount of diamagnetism. But once again, we still haven't verified all of that for sure. He didn't have an ohm meter in the video, right? Like all it shows is that there's levitation. We need to see more, but that is pretty suggestive. In fact, this is specifically what part of Hyun-Tak Kim was saying in his video, right? Samples can vary from like 24x the diamagnetism of pyrolytic graphite all the way up to 5,450 times the diamagnetism of pyrolytic graphite, which in the good samples like that are then comparable to some superconductors. So there's also a lot of things that we don't know that we really have to go over, which let's do that now. So what things that we don't know that we really do need to get a better idea of? One, what exactly is the structure here? So the copper substitution that the authors are suggesting that have been analyzed with the DFT plus U experiments before, or the simulations, is that correct? I mean, supposedly this is a very thermodynamically unstable, potentially even impossible, not necessarily impossible, but very unlikely configuration. Like it's not actually, of course, this is potentially why there's a very low yield, because it's very thermodynamically unfavorable for the copper to go into that particular place in the lead apatite matrix. But what if that's not even the right structure in the end? So that leads to another thing. What about these stoichiometries? Apparently the actual stoichiometries of the reactants that they used were very disproportionate for a solid phase reaction. Maybe, as some have suggested, if some of the impurities are important, maybe the superconducting phase is actually not even what they've suggested. Maybe it's kind of the excess phase with a little bit of the sulfates in it. Hard to tell right now. We haven't actually excluded that possibility. Some have suggested it. The thermal vapor deposition data that we have so far have huge gaps in it. So, I mean, It is the most promising of the actual numbers that we've seen so far. So in terms of resistance, it reports 10 to the negative 10 ohm centimeters, right? So the bulk samples, we're measuring something like 10 to the negative 5 or negative 6 ohm centimeters, which is not even as good as copper at that temperature and pressure. But if it's 10 to the negative 10, then all right, that's interesting. But this is in thermal vapor deposition data that is lacking in a lot of really important details. What is the thickness of the film? What is the geometry of the film? What exactly is the composition and the structure of that? They didn't really characterize it post-deposition. Did it actually depose in the exact structure that they're saying it did? Supposedly something was deposed there with the resistivity of 10 to the negative 10, but what exactly was that? And you know, there's a lot of details. How did they even, what instrument did they measure it in? Under what conditions did they measure it in? All of that was left out. But that needs to be replicated, because that is the resistance that we would actually want to call it, you know, a useful superconductor. We don't know the London penetration depth. Remember that with a classical superconductor, this may be, you know, the result that we find may be different than in a type 1 superconductor like mercury or something. But the London penetration depth, remember that internal to that superconductor, the magnetic field should be canceled out, right? The London penetration depth gives you the extent, the depth at which you start to get an exponential decay of the internal magnetic field to the point where it goes to, you know, ideally 0, where there's no internal magnetic field. There's a depth there. You would use like muon spin spectroscopy. Maybe they didn't have that in the original place where it was analyzed, and they want to get that measurement. Let's see. That is something that we need to get, you know, finalized and really characterize that part of its physics. And also, we really need to get a solid theoretical underpinning for all of this, because BCS theory, the way that we classically describe superconducting physics, doesn't seem to actually really be adequate for this. And you know, there's suggestions of the one-dimensional superconductor theory. There's an Indian Bhaskaran, I don't know how to pronounce that exactly, who's suggesting something about broadband localization. There's a lot of different possibilities, but a lot of ones have been suggested using known concepts, right? So believable things. We just have to really figure out what exactly is going on here. And that's it for today. I'll keep an ear to the ground and update you when I get more. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, like and subscribe.